In the wind-swept canyons of Arizona Territory, where the red earth meets an endless sky, a lone figure crouched behind weathered sandstone, watching death approach on horseback. Through his spyglass, Daniel Whitehorse counted 12 riders wearing the blue uniforms of the territorial militia, but their faces told a different story. These were not soldiers serving justice, but men bent on massacre. Below in the valley, the small adobe schoolhouse of Mesa Verde stood peaceful in the afternoon sun, unaware that within the hour, 5 orphan children and their young teacher would become targets in a war they never chose to fight. What the approaching riders didn't know was that watching over that schoolhouse was a half-blood scout whose own tragic past had prepared him for this exact moment, a man who would soon discover that saving these innocents meant confronting the most devastating secret of his life. This is the story of how one man's quest for redemption became a family's salvation, and how the bonds of blood proved stronger than the hatred that had torn a territory apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Sangre de Cristo mountains like ghostly fingers as Daniel Whitehorse guided his paint horse down the treacherous trail toward Mesa Verde. At 28, he carried himself with the fluid grace of his Apache mother's people, while his keen blue eyes, inherited from a father he'd never known, scanned the horizon with the wariness of a man who trusted neither world completely. Daniel's buckskin clothing bore the practical modifications of a professional scout. Reinforced leather at stress points, hidden pockets for emergency supplies, and a knife sheath positioned for quick access. His Winchester rifle rode easy in its saddle holster, balanced by a Colt revolver on his hip, tools of survival in a land where violence erupted without warning. The letter from Colonel Marcus Hayes crinkled in his shirt pocket as his horse picked its way through loose shale. Hayes had been Daniel's commanding officer during his brief service with the Territorial Scouts, one of the few white men who'd shown him genuine respect. The colonel's request was simple: investigate reports of militia activity near Mesa Verde and assess potential threats to civilian populations. What the letter didn't mention, but Daniel suspected, was that someone in the territorial government was using unofficial military units to solve problems that regular law couldn't address. The Apache raids had decreased significantly in recent months, but fear and hatred ran deep in the hearts of settlers who'd lost family and property to years of brutal conflict. Daniel understood that hatred intimately. His own mother, Morning Star, had been killed during a cavalry raid when he was 12, shot down while trying to protect the women and children of her band. The soldiers who killed her never knew she'd been married to a white trader, never cared that her son watched from hiding as her blood soaked into the desert sand. That trauma had shaped Daniel's entire adult life, driving him to serve as a bridge between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. His knowledge of Apache customs and territory made him valuable to the military, while his white father's blood granted him acceptance in frontier settlements. But acceptance wasn't belonging, and Daniel had spent 16 years wandering between cultures that claimed him but never truly embraced him. The trail descended into a broad valley where cottonwoods marked the course of a seasonal creek. Mesa Verde had been established 5 years earlier as a farming community, built around natural springs that promised year-round water. The settlement consisted of perhaps 30 families, mostly hard-working immigrants who'd come west seeking opportunity rather than adventure. Daniel had visited Mesa Verde twice before during his scouting duties, and he remembered it as a peaceful place where children played in dusty streets while their parents worked fields of corn and beans. The community had managed to avoid the worst of the Apache conflicts through a combination of luck, isolation, and the pragmatic leadership of men who preferred negotiation to violence. As he approached the settlement's outskirts, Daniel noticed details that set his professional instincts on edge. No children played in the streets, though the afternoon hour suggested school had been dismissed. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, despite the autumn chill that would normally have families gathering around their hearths. Most telling of, all the usually busy main street stood empty, except for a handful of horses tied outside the general store. Daniel dismounted near the edge of town, securing his paint horse to a stunted oak before proceeding on foot. His Apache training had taught him to approach potentially dangerous situations with patience and stealth, gathering information before committing to action. The empty streets could indicate many things: illness, evacuation, or preparation for trouble. The general store's proprietor, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, looked up nervously as Daniel entered. Weber had always been friendly during previous visits, eager to discuss the challenges of frontier commerce. Today, his weathered face showed strain, and his hands trembled slightly as he arranged inventory with unnecessary precision. "Mr. Whitehorse," Weber said, his accent thickening with anxiety, "I did not expect to see you here today." "Colonel Hayes sent me to check on things," Daniel replied, noting how Weber's eyes darted toward the store's back room. "Seems quiet for a Tuesday afternoon." Weber nodded rapidly, too rapidly for genuine agreement. "Yes, very quiet. Many families have gone to visit relatives in other towns. Harvest time, you understand?" The explanation felt rehearsed, and Daniel recognized the signs of a man under pressure to maintain a story he didn't believe. Weber's inventory had been rearranged to create clear sightlines to both the front door and windows. The behavior of someone expecting trouble. "What about the school?" Daniel asked casually. "Miss Carson still teaching?" The mention of the teacher caused Weber's composure to crack slightly. Rebecca Carson had arrived in Mesa Verde 18 months earlier, a young woman from back east who'd answered an advertisement for an educator. She'd won the community's respect through her dedication to the children and her willingness to adapt to frontier conditions. "Yes, the school continues," Weber said, but his tone suggested complications. "Miss Carson she is very dedicated to her students." Daniel sensed there was more to the story, but pressing Weber for details would likely cause the nervous shopkeeper to retreat into protective silence. Instead, he purchased supplies he didn't need while observing the store's other customers. 3 men sat around a checkerboard near the window, their conversation stopping whenever Daniel glanced in their direction. The men wore the practical clothing of farmers and laborers, but their posture and the way they positioned themselves suggested military experience. One carried a concealed pistol beneath his work shirt, while another kept glancing at a saddled horse visible through the window. These weren't townspeople relaxing during a break from harvest work. They were sentries watching for something specific. Daniel completed his purchases and stepped back onto the empty street, his mind racing through possibilities. The settlement showed all the signs of a community preparing for siege or evacuation, but he'd seen no evidence of Apache activity in the region. If the threat wasn't coming from hostile tribes, then it was likely coming from other whites. The political situation in Arizona Territory had grown increasingly complex as statehood approached. Competing factions struggled for control of land, mining rights, and government contracts. Some groups had formed private militias to advance their interests, operating under the thin pretense of protecting settlers from Indian raids. Daniel had encountered such units before during his scouting work. They typically consisted of civil war veterans, failed prospectors, and men who'd found violence more profitable than honest labor. These unofficial armies answered to wealthy businessmen or political leaders who preferred to keep their hands clean while pursuing questionable objectives. As he walked toward the schoolhouse, Daniel considered the tactical situation. If armed, men were approaching Mesa Verde with hostile intent, the scattered nature of the settlement would make defense nearly impossible. The town had no fortifications, no organized militia, and no rapid means of communication with territorial authorities. The schoolhouse sat at Mesa Verde's eastern edge, a modest adobe structure with a bell tower and a small garden where Miss Carson grew vegetables for her students' lunches. Daniel had admired the building during previous visits, noting how its thick walls and strategic position would provide excellent defensive cover if properly utilized. Today, the schoolhouse windows glowed with warm lamplight despite the afternoon hour. Through the glass, Daniel could see small figures moving about inside, children who should have been home with their families if the town was preparing for trouble. Their presence suggested either that the adults considered the school the safest location, or that these particular children had nowhere else to go. Daniel approached the building cautiously, his hand resting on his pistol grip while his eyes scanned for potential threats. The school's isolation from the main settlement could be an advantage for defenders, but it also made the building vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. A woman's voice drifted through the windows, soft but confident as she led the children through what sounded like arithmetic lessons. Rebecca Carson had earned a reputation for maintaining educational standards despite frontier hardships, refusing to lower her expectations simply because her students lived in a remote territory. Daniel had never spoken directly with Miss Carson. During his previous visits, though he'd observed her from a distance while conducting his official duties, she appeared to be in her mid-20s, with auburn hair typically arranged in a practical bun and clothing that balanced feminine style with frontier durability. Her bearing suggested education and refinement, but also the strength necessary to survive in a harsh environment. As he drew closer to the schoolhouse, Daniel heard something that made his blood run cold. The distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. From the north, multiple horses moving at a steady pace, too organized to be casual travelers or returning townspeople. His experienced ear counted at least 10 riders, possibly more, heading directly toward Mesa Verde. The approaching horsemen could be legitimate territorial militia responding to reported troubles, but Daniel's instincts screamed warning. Something, but the timing, the townspeople's nervous behavior, and the isolation of the schoolhouse suggested a trap being sprung. Daniel reached the schoolhouse door just as the sound of approaching riders became audible to untrained ears. Through the window, he saw Miss Carson's head turn sharply toward the sound, her face reflecting the same alarm that had gripped him moments earlier. Inside the classroom, 5 children, all appearing to be between the ages of 6 and 12, looked up from their books with expressions of growing fear. The scene inside the schoolhouse struck Daniel with unexpected emotional force. These weren't just students caught in a dangerous situation. They were orphans. He could tell from their clothing, which bore the telltale signs of charity and hand-me-downs, and from the way they instinctively moved closer to their teacher. When frightened, these children had already lost everything once, and now faced the possibility of losing the only stability they'd found. Miss Carson moved quickly to the windows, pulling down the wooden shutters that could provide some protection from gunfire. Her movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd prepared for trouble. As she secured the last shutter, her eyes met Daniel's through the glass, and he saw not panic, but fierce determination to protect her. Charges. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by voices and the jingle of military equipment. Daniel pressed himself against the schoolhouse wall, using his position to observe the approaching riders while remaining hidden from their view. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. 12 men in partial military uniform rode toward Mesa Verde. In loose formation, their weapons prominently displayed, and their faces showing the hard excitement of men preparing for violence. These weren't soldiers responding to an emergency. They were a hunting party closing in on predetermined prey. Daniel recognized the lead rider from wanted posters circulated among territorial law enforcement. Captain Wade Morrison commanded one of the territory's most notorious unofficial militia units, a group that claimed to hunt Apache raiders but spent most of their time terrorizing Mexican and mixed-blood families whose land holdings attracted white settlers' attention. The realization hit Daniel like a physical blow. The schoolhouse wasn't just sheltering orphans. It was harboring children whose heritage made them targets for Morrison's particular brand of justice. These weren't random victims caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were the deliberate objective of a massacre disguised as military action. As Morrison's men approached the schoolhouse, Daniel faced a choice that would define not only his own future, but the fate of 6 innocent lives. He could withdraw to a safe distance and observe, gathering intelligence for his official report while avoiding personal involvement in what was clearly a complex political situation. Or he could step forward and place himself between predators and prey, risking everything to protect strangers whose only crime was existing in a world that had no place for people like them, people like him. The sound of spurs on hard ground announced that Morrison's men had dismounted and were approaching the schoolhouse on foot. Through gaps in the shutters, Daniel could see Miss Carson gathering her students into the building's most defensible corner, her young face set with the grim determination of someone prepared to die protecting those in her care. Time slowed as Daniel weighed his options, knowing that his next decision would ripple through multiple lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. In the distance, smoke began rising from Mesa Verde proper, suggesting that Morrison's men had already begun their work in the main settlement. The hunt had begun, and Daniel Whitehorse stood at the crossroads between survival and sacrifice, between the safety of solitude and the terrible responsibility of belonging to something larger than himself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back into the story. Daniel's decision crystallized as Morrison's boots scraped against the schoolhouse steps. The half-blood scout slipped around the building's corner, positioning himself where he could observe the militia leader's approach while remaining hidden from the other men who had spread out to surround the structure. Captain Wade Morrison stood, 6 feet tall with the bearing of a career soldier, his grey uniform bearing the insignia of rank that meant nothing outside the lawless territories where he operated. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. A souvenir from the war that had taught him violence was often the most efficient solution to complex problems. "Miss Rebecca Carson," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a predator playing with cornered prey. "I'm Captain Morrison of the Territorial Security Force. I need to speak with you about the children in your care." Through a gap in the wooden shutters, Daniel saw the young teacher's profile as she pressed herself against the wall beside the door. Her auburn hair had escaped its careful arrangement, framing a face that showed fear but no surrender. In her arms, she held the youngest of her students, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "The school is closed for the day, Captain," Rebecca called back, her voice steady despite the tremor Daniel could detect in her hands. "These children are under my protection, and I'll ask you to conduct any official business through proper territorial channels." Morrison's laugh held no warmth. "Miss Carson, I'm afraid territorial law is quite clear about the custody of abandoned mixed-blood children. These young ones need to be relocated to appropriate facilities where they can receive proper guidance." The euphemism chilled Daniel to his core. Appropriate facilities was the polite term for the reservation schools, where mixed-blood children were systematically stripped of their heritage and broken down to create compliant laborers. Many who entered such institutions never emerged alive. Daniel studied the 5 children huddled around their teacher through the window gap. Even in their fear, he could see the telltale signs Morrison's men would have noticed. The high cheekbones and dark eyes that marked Apache heritage, combined with lighter skin tones suggesting white fathers who had likely abandoned their mixed-race offspring to uncertain fates. The oldest boy appeared to be around 12, with intelligent dark eyes and the wary posture of someone who'd learned early that survival required constant vigilance. Beside him stood a girl of perhaps 10, her black braids adorned with small ribbons that Rebecca had probably provided. The middle children, twin boys who looked to be 8, clung to each other with the desperate intensity of siblings who'd already lost too much. But it was the youngest child, the little girl in Rebecca's arms, who struck Daniel with unexpected recognition. Her delicate features and the particular shade of her brown eyes triggered a memory so powerful it nearly staggered him. "Miss Carson," Morrison continued, "I'm going to count to 10. Then my men are coming inside to collect these. Children, you can make this easy on yourself by opening the door, or you can make it hard. The outcome will be the same either way." Daniel's mind raced through tactical options, while emotions he'd buried for years threatened to overwhelm his professional training. The schoolhouse's adobe construction would stop most rifle rounds, but Morrison's men could easily set fire to the wooden roof or door. The building had only one exit, making it a death trap if the militia decided to eliminate witnesses along with their primary targets. More troubling was the growing certainty that Daniel recognized something familiar in the youngest child's features. Memory fragments from his early childhood surfaced unbidden. A woman's lullaby sung in Apache, while gentle hands braided his hair, whispered stories of family members scattered by war and prejudice. 1, Morrison began counting, his voice carrying across the empty schoolyard like a funeral bell. Daniel emerged from concealment, his hands visible but ready to move to his weapons. "Captain Morrison," he called out calmly. "Daniel Whitehorse, territorial scout. Colonel Hayes sent me to investigate reports of civilian disturbances in this area." Morrison's scarred face turned toward Daniel with predatory interest. The militia leader had clearly heard of the half-blood scout whose tracking abilities made him valuable to territorial authorities, but whose mixed heritage made him inherently untrustworthy in Morrison's worldview. "Mr. Whitehorse," Morrison replied with false courtesy. "How convenient. Perhaps you can help resolve this situation quickly. These children are wards of the territory now, and they need to be transported to proper facilities." 2. Morrison continued his count without pausing, making clear that Daniel's presence wouldn't delay his plans. Daniel stepped closer, his scout's training allowing him to assess Morrison's men while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. 12 riders had indeed surrounded the schoolhouse, but their positions showed more enthusiasm than tactical discipline. These were men accustomed to terrorizing defenseless families, not confronting prepared resistance. "What's the legal justification for removing children from an established school?" Daniel asked, buying time while evaluating escape routes. Morrison's smile revealed teeth stained by tobacco and coffee. "These aren't regular students, Scout. They're abandoned half-breeds whose presence threatens community stability. The good people of Mesa Verde have petitioned for their removal." 3. Through the schoolhouse window, Daniel caught Rebecca's eye and saw recognition flash across her features. She knew who he was, not just his name and reputation, but something deeper that made her pupils dilate with shock and hope combined. "Mr. Whitehorse," Rebecca called out suddenly, her voice carrying an urgency that had nothing to do with Morrison's threat. These children aren't abandoned. They have family that's been searching for them. The statement struck Daniel like lightning. He stared at the young teacher's face, seeing knowledge there that she shouldn't possess unless... 4. Memory crashed over Daniel like a flash flood. His sister, Morning Star's daughter, born just months before the cavalry raid that destroyed their band. The infant he'd last seen as a toddler, hidden in a cave while soldiers burned their village. His niece, lost for 16 years, while he searched the territories for any trace of surviving family. The youngest child in Rebecca's arms wasn't just another mixed-blood orphan. She was Sarah Whitehorse, daughter of his murdered sister, the last blood relative he had in the world. 5. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Morrison's men had already noticed the gesture. Multiple weapons swung toward him as the militia leader's count continued relentlessly. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Scout," Morrison warned. "You're outnumbered 12-1, and interfering with official territorial business carries serious consequences." 6. Rebecca pressed herself against the window, her voice urgent as she spoke directly to Daniel. "The children came to me 6 months ago. Sarah, the little one, she's been having dreams about a man with blue eyes who sings Apache lullabies. She draws pictures of him constantly." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. His mother had taught him those same lullabies, sung in the Apache language, while she worked on traditional crafts in the evenings. If Sarah was dreaming of those songs, she was remembering fragments of her earliest childhood, memories that included him. 7. Morrison's patience was wearing thin, his hand moving to the pistol holstered at his side. "Miss Carson, this is your final warning. Open that door, or we'll open it for you." Daniel's tactical mind wrestled with impossible odds while his heart processed the earth-shattering discovery that his niece was alive. 12 armed men surrounded a building containing the only family he had left in the world. A direct confrontation would likely result in everyone's death, but surrender would condemn the children to fates worse than clean death in battle. 8. The sound of splintering wood announced that some of Morrison's men had grown tired of waiting. They were using rifle butts to batter down the schoolhouse's rear door, creating the distraction Daniel needed to act. He drew his Winchester in one fluid motion, levering around into the chamber while dropping to one knee behind a water trough. The movement saved his life as 3 rifles fired simultaneously, their bullets passing through the space where his chest had been moments before. 9. Daniel's first shot took down the militiaman closest to the schoolhouse's front door, the .44-40 slug spinning the man around before dropping him in the dust. His second shot shattered the window where another attacker was taking aim at Rebecca and the children. 10. Morrison's count reached its conclusion just as the rear door gave way with a thunderous crash. Armed men poured through the opening while Daniel's rifle spoke again, the schoolhouse erupting into chaos as Rebecca herded her students toward the only corner that offered any protection. But as bullets began flying and men shouted orders, Daniel heard something that changed everything. Sarah's voice, crying out in perfect Apache for her uncle to save them. The little girl he'd mourned as dead for 16 years was calling his name in their mother's language, confirming beyond doubt that she remembered him despite the years of separation. The battle for the schoolhouse had begun, but for Daniel Whitehorse, this was no longer about protecting strangers from injustice. This was about family, blood, and a debt of love that transcended death itself. Morrison's voice rose above the gunfire, shouting orders that revealed the true scope of his mission. "Take the teacher alive. She knows too much to kill quickly, but the half-breed children don't need to survive the transport. Daniel's blood turned to ice as he realized Rebecca Carson possessed knowledge that made her valuable to Morrison's employers. Whatever she knew about the children's backgrounds went far beyond simple humanitarian concern. She was protecting secrets that powerful people would kill to keep buried. As the gun battle intensified around the schoolhouse, Daniel began to understand that he'd stumbled into something far larger than a simple raid on mixed-blood orphans. These children weren't just random victims of racial hatred. They were specific targets whose very existence threatened someone with enough influence to field a private army. The mystery deepened as Rebecca's voice carried across the chaos, speaking to the children in fluent Apache while maintaining defensive positions with the skill of someone who'd clearly received military training. This wasn't the first time the young teacher had faced armed attackers, and her expertise with the situation suggested a past far more complex than that of a simple frontier educator. Daniel's next shot dropped another militiaman, but Morrison's remaining men were beginning to coordinate their assault. Time was running out for the defenders, and Daniel knew that his family's survival would require more than just superior marksmanship. As smoke filled the schoolhouse and Sarah's cries echoed in his ears, Daniel Whitehorse prepared to discover just how far a man would go to protect the last fragments of a family he'd thought lost forever. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the schoolhouse as Daniel pressed his back against the adobe wall, reloading his Winchester while calculating the dwindling odds of survival. Through the smoke-hazed air, he could see Rebecca Carson moving with military precision, using overturned desks to create defensive positions while keeping the 5 children protected in the building's safest corner. What struck Daniel most profoundly wasn't her courage under fire. Frontier teachers often possessed remarkable fortitude, but the way she handled the rifle she'd produced from some hidden cache. Her stance, her breathing, the economical way she acquired targets all spoke of formal training that went far beyond basic frontier self-defense. "Sarah, keep your head down," Rebecca commanded in fluent Apache, confirming Daniel's growing suspicion that this woman's connection to the children ran deeper than simple educational responsibility. "Thomas, watch the window. Maria, help me with the ammunition." The oldest boy, Thomas, moved to comply with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to following orders during crisis situations. At 12 years old, he displayed a maturity that spoke of premature exposure to violence and danger. His dark eyes tracked Morrison's men with the calculating assessment of a seasoned fighter, not a frightened child. Daniel's third shot found its mark, dropping another militiaman who'd been trying to flank their position. But Morrison's remaining 9 men were adapting their tactics, using the settlement's other buildings as cover while they maneuvered for better firing positions. "Whitehorse," Morrison's voice carried across the gunfire-torn afternoon. "You're fighting for the wrong side. These children are worth more dead than alive to certain parties. Walk away now, and I'll make sure you're well compensated for your discretion." The offer revealed crucial information about Morrison's true employers. This wasn't a spontaneous raid driven by racial hatred. It was a calculated assassination, disguised as militia action. Someone with significant resources had marked these specific children for elimination, and that someone possessed enough influence to field a private army for the task. Daniel ignored Morrison's proposition, focusing instead on a more immediate tactical problem. The schoolhouse's thick adobe walls provided excellent protection from rifle fire, but the wooden roof and door frames remained vulnerable to fire arrows or explosive charges. Morrison's men would eventually realize they could smoke out the defenders if direct assault proved too costly. "Miss Carson," Daniel called out during a brief lull in the shooting, "what aren't you telling me about these children?" Rebecca's green eyes met his across the smoke-filled room, and Daniel saw resignation mixed with desperate hope. Whatever secrets she'd been protecting were about to be revealed by circumstances beyond her control. "They're not orphans," she said, simply her words carrying the weight of a confession that had been building for months. "They're witnesses." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. Witnesses to what crime could make 5 children targets for assassination. What had they seen that required their permanent silence? "The Clearwater Massacre," Rebecca continued, her voice barely audible above the sporadic gunfire. 6 months ago, a Apache peace delegation was murdered while traveling under Army protection to negotiate a new treaty. The official report blamed rogue Apache raiders, but these children were there. They saw who really pulled the triggers. Daniel's blood turned to ice as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The Clearwater Massacre had been a pivotal moment in territorial politics, used to justify increased military funding and the expansion of civilian militia authority. If the children had witnessed Army personnel or their civilian allies murdering peace negotiators, their testimony could topple careers and trigger federal investigations. "Thomas was the peace chief's grandson," Rebecca explained while reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "Maria and the twins are daughters of tribal leaders who'd come to support the negotiations. Sarah—" She paused, looking directly at Daniel. "Sarah is Morningstar's daughter. Her mother was serving as a translator when the shooting started." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Morningstar hadn't died in a random cavalry raid 16 years ago. She'd been murdered 6 months ago while trying to prevent war through negotiation. Daniel had been searching for his sister in the wrong time period, mourning a death that had occurred recently rather than in his childhood memories. Sarah's small voice cut through the chaos, speaking in Apache. "Uncle, the bad men killed Mama when she was trying to make peace. She told me to remember their faces so the truth wouldn't die with her." Daniel's hands shook as emotion threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. His sister had died protecting the peace process, and her daughter had inherited the terrible burden of bearing witness to that murder. The little girl he'd thought lost to childhood tragedy was actually the survivor of a political assassination that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. Morrison's voice boomed across the battlefield again. "Time's running out, Carson. My employers don't care if you burn alive, but they'd prefer to ask you some questions first. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee the children die quickly." The threat confirmed Rebecca's value as more than just a random teacher caught in the crossfire. She possessed knowledge that Morrison's employers needed, even as they sought to eliminate the child witnesses permanently. "Who are you really?" Daniel asked Rebecca during another brief ceasefire. Her laugh held no humor. "Lieutenant Rebecca Carson, formerly of Army Intelligence. I was investigating irregularities in territorial militia contracts when I discovered the plot against the peace delegation. I arrived too late to prevent the massacre, but in time to rescue the children." The revelation explained everything: her military bearing, her knowledge of Apache language and customs, her ability to coordinate defensive positions under fire. Rebecca Carson wasn't a frontier teacher who'd stumbled into danger. She was an undercover federal agent who'd been hunting the same conspiracy that was now hunting her. "The children are my witnesses," she continued, "and my evidence. Their testimony, combined with what I've gathered during 6 months of investigation, could expose a corruption network that reaches from territorial militia commands to federal congressional offices." Daniel processed this information while tracking Morrison's men through the schoolhouse windows. The political implications were staggering. If territorial officials had orchestrated the Clearwater Massacre to justify increased military appropriations, the scandal could reshape the entire southwestern frontier. But first, they had to survive the next hour. Morrison had clearly grown tired of negotiation. His remaining men were taking positions for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the schoolhouse's defenders through sheer firepower. Daniel counted 8 rifles pointed at various windows and doorways, while Morrison himself approached under cover with what appeared to be a bundle of dynamite. "They're going to blow the building," Daniel announced, recognizing the militia leaders. "Tactical shift." Rebecca nodded grimly. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor in the northeast corner. It connects to a tunnel system the original builder used for water access. If we can reach it, we might be able to escape underground." The escape route offered hope, but accessing it would require exposing themselves to concentrated gunfire while moving the children across open space. Thomas and the twins might make the journey successfully, but 6-year-old Sarah and 10-year-old Maria would need protection that could prove fatal to their guardians. "I'll create a distraction," Daniel said, checking his remaining ammunition. "When I start shooting, get the children to that cellar." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "We go, together or not at all. These children have lost too many protectors already." Her determination reminded Daniel of his sister's legendary stubbornness, the family trait that had made Morning Star willing to risk everything for peace negotiations. The same courage that had gotten her killed was now manifesting in the woman, who dedicated her life to protecting Morning Star's daughter. Morrison's voice carried a note of finality. 30 seconds, Carson. Then this building becomes a crater." Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. Instead of preparing for a last stand, he began moving toward the door, his rifle held in a gesture of surrender. "What are you doing?" Rebecca hissed. "Something my sister would have done," Daniel replied. "Buying time with truth." He stepped outside with his hands partially raised, the Winchester held obviously but not threateningly. Morrison's men immediately trained their weapons on him, but their leader gestured for them to hold fire. "Captain Morrison," Daniel called out clearly, "before you blow up this building, you should know that these children aren't the only witnesses to what happened at Clearwater." Morrison's scarred face showed sudden uncertainty. "What are you talking about, Scout?" "I was there too," Daniel lied smoothly, gambling that Morrison wouldn't risk eliminating potential evidence without confirming its scope. "Tracking for the army escort when your men opened fire on the peace delegation. I saw everything, and I've been wondering for 6 months why the official report didn't match what I witnessed." The fabrication bought precious seconds as Morrison processed the implications. If Daniel had been an official witness, his disappearance would trigger federal investigation regardless of what happened to the children. "You're lying," Morrison said, but doubt crept into his voice. "Am I?" Daniel replied, taking another step closer. "Would you like me to describe exactly how your riflemen were positioned when they murdered Chief Standing Bear? Or should I start with how they shot the women first to prevent any survivors from escaping?" Morrison's face went pale as Daniel's fictional testimony hit uncomfortably close to actual events. The militia leader's employers had clearly provided him with detailed briefings about what the children might have witnessed, and Daniel's words matched those details too closely for comfort. Behind him, Daniel heard subtle sounds that indicated Rebecca was moving the children toward the escape tunnel. Every second of Morrison's uncertainty meant greater chance of successful evacuation. But Daniel's gamble carried enormous risk. If Morrison decided to eliminate all witnesses, regardless of consequences, the next few moments would determine whether the truth about Clearwater ever saw daylight. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as 2 men faced each other across a divide measured not just in yards, but in the vast gulf between justice and expedience, between truth and profitable lies. Morrison's hand tightened on the dynamite bundle as his calculating mind weighed Daniel's claims against the urgent need to complete his mission The militia leader had built his reputation on decisive action, but the possibility of additional witnesses introduced complications that his employers hadn't anticipated. "Sergeant Collins," Morrison barked to one of his men. "Check our briefing. Files. Was there any mention of Army scouts attached to the Clearwater escort?" While Collins rifled through a leather satchel, Daniel caught movement in his peripheral vision. Rebecca had successfully moved 3 of the children to the northeast corner of the schoolhouse, but Thomas and Sarah remained visible through the window, the older boy refusing to abandon his position until his younger sister was safely evacuated. "Sir," Collins reported after examining several documents, "no official scouts listed, but the report mentions additional personnel without specific identification." The vague phrasing gave Daniel's deception just enough credibility to sow doubt. Morrison's scarred face twisted with frustration as he realized his clean assassination was becoming increasingly complicated. "Even if you were there, Scout," Morrison said slowly, "your word against official Army reports won't carry much weight with territorial authorities." Daniel smiled coldly. "Maybe not with territorial authorities, but it might interest federal investigators, especially when they learn that certain congressional appropriations were based on falsified massacre reports." Behind Morrison, several of his men exchanged nervous glances. These weren't career soldiers bound by military discipline. They were hired guns whose loyalty extended only as far as their paychecks. The prospect of federal investigation into their activities made them visibly uncomfortable. Morrison sensed his men's growing unease. "Federal investigators can be dealt with," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My employers have connections that reach—" A rifle shot from an unexpected direction cut off Morrison's words. One of his perimeter guards toppled from his position behind the general store, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. The shot had come from the settlement's main street, indicating the arrival of additional players in an already complex situation. "What the hell?" Morrison spun toward the source of the gunfire just as more shots erupted from multiple positions around Mesa Verde. His carefully planned operation was suddenly under attack from unknown forces. Daniel didn't waste the opportunity. He dove toward the schoolhouse entrance as Morrison's men scrambled to identify and engage their new assailants. In the confusion, he glimpsed riders approaching from the south. Not militia uniforms, but the practical clothing of ranchers and townspeople. Inside the schoolhouse, Rebecca had vanished along with 4 of the 5 children. Only Thomas remained, his young face set with determination as he clutched a rusty revolver that looked enormous in his small hands. "Where are the others?" Daniel demanded. "In the tunnel," Thomas replied without taking his eyes off the windows. "Miss Carson said to wait for you." "Then let's go." Daniel grabbed the boy's shoulder, but Thomas pulled away. "Someone needs to hold them here, or they'll follow us into the tunnel," the 12-year-old said, with adult reasoning that chilled Daniel's blood. "I can shoot straight enough to make them think we're all still fighting." The tactical logic was sound, but morally impossible. Daniel couldn't abandon a child to face Morrison's men alone, regardless of strategic necessity. "We leave together," Daniel said firmly, scooping Thomas up despite the boy's protests. "Your mother's people believe that dying alone brings dishonor to the entire family." Daniel's reference to Apache cultural beliefs broke through Thomas's stubborn determination. The boy stopped struggling and allowed himself to be carried toward the escape route that Rebecca had prepared. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath loose floorboards in what had appeared to be a storage closet. Rebecca's intelligence training had clearly included preparation for emergency evacuations, and she'd spent months modifying the schoolhouse's original water access system into a viable escape route. Daniel lowered himself through the narrow opening. First, his feet finding rough-hewn ladder rungs that descended into darkness. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and ancient wood, but it felt solid enough to support their weight. Above them, gunfire intensified as Morrison's men engaged their mysterious new attackers. The chaos would provide cover for their escape, but it also meant that whoever had come to their aid was risking their lives without knowing the full scope of what they were defending. The tunnel stretched southward beneath the schoolhouse, its walls shored up with timber supports that suggested professional construction. Rebecca had clearly invested significant time and resources in creating this escape route, further evidence that her presence in Mesa Verde represented long-term strategic planning rather than random assignment. "Miss Carson," Daniel called softly, "into the darkness ahead. Where does this tunnel lead?" Her voice drifted back from perhaps 20 yards away. "To the old Spanish mine shaft system. From there, we can reach the canyon, where I've hidden supplies and horses." The escape plan was more sophisticated than Daniel had imagined. Rebecca hadn't just rescued the children from the Clearwater Massacre. She'd been preparing for months to evacuate them when their discovery became inevitable. As they moved through the underground passage, Sarah's small hand found Daniel's in the darkness. Her whispered words in Apache cut through his tactical focus like a knife. "Uncle, Mama told me you would come. She said the spirits would guide you to us when we needed you most." The statement suggested that Morning Star had retained memory of her brother throughout their years of separation, and had somehow transmitted that knowledge to her daughter, despite the dangers of revealing family connections in hostile territory. "What else did your mother tell you about me?" Daniel asked gently. "She said you carried sadness because you thought your family was all dead," Sarah replied with the matter-of-fact honesty of childhood. "She said you didn't know we were alive because the soldiers lied about what happened to our people." Daniel's throat tightened as he realized the full scope of deception that had shaped his adult life. The cavalry raid he'd witnessed as a child hadn't killed his sister. It had scattered their band and created false records that prevented family members from finding each other. Morning Star had spent 16 years believing her brother was dead, while Daniel had mourned a sister who was actually alive and searching for him. The tunnel began to slope upward, indicating they were approaching the exit point. Ahead, Daniel could see faint daylight filtering through what appeared to be a carefully concealed opening. Rebecca waited for them in a natural cave that connected to the tunnel system. She'd established a supply cache that included food, water, ammunition, and warm clothing sized for children. Most importantly, she'd hidden 5 horses in a side canyon that would allow them to escape Mesa Verde without returning to the main settlement. "How long have you been planning this evacuation?" Daniel asked as Rebecca helped the children into warmer clothing. "Since the day I arrived," she replied matter-of-factly. "My investigation indicated that discovery was inevitable once someone connected the children's presence to the Clearwater Massacre. I've been preparing multiple escape routes and supply caches throughout the territory." Her preparation revealed the scope of the conspiracy she'd been investigating. Rebecca hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of corruption. She'd been conducting a systematic intelligence operation that required months of careful planning and significant resources. "Who's providing your support?" Daniel pressed. "Army intelligence doesn't usually operate with this level of autonomy." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Because Army intelligence has been compromised. Some of my own superiors are involved in the conspiracy. I've been operating independently since I discovered the scope of the corruption." The revelation explained why Rebecca had been working alone to protect the children. She couldn't trust official channels because those channels had been infiltrated by the same people who'd ordered the Clearwater Massacre. "Then who's shooting at Morrison's men up there?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward the sounds of battle still echoing from the schoolhouse area. Rebecca smiled for the first time since Daniel had met her. "Local ranchers and farmers. It turns out that honest people don't appreciate militia units terrorizing their neighbors, even when those neighbors happen to be mixed-blood children. The news that community members had rallied to defend the schoolhouse provided hope that not everyone in the territory had been corrupted by the conspiracy. But it also meant that innocent people were risking their lives in a battle they didn't fully understand. Thomas spoke up from where he was helping Maria with her boots. "Miss Carson, what happens now? Even if we escape, they'll keep hunting us." The boy's question cut to the heart of their long-term survival prospects. Morrison represented only one tentacle of a conspiracy that reached into territorial government and federal agencies. Escaping this immediate threat wouldn't eliminate the underlying danger. "Now we take the fight to them," Rebecca replied, with quiet determination. "We have evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, we have the truth. It's time to stop running and start exposing the people responsible for murdering peace delegations." Daniel studied Rebecca's face in the cave's dim light, recognizing the expression of someone who'd moved beyond simple survival into active resistance. She wasn't just protecting the children anymore. She was preparing to use their testimony to bring down the entire corruption network. "That's going to require more than just the 6 of us," Daniel observed. Rebecca nodded. "Which is why we're going to Denver. I have contacts there who can't be bought, and federal prosecutors who specialize in territorial corruption cases. If we can get the children's testimony on record, we can trigger investigations that will reach all the way to Washington." The plan was ambitious, but it offered something that running and hiding couldn't provide: a chance to honor Morningstar's sacrifice by ensuring that her death would ultimately serve the cause of justice rather than the interests of her murderers. They prepared to mount their horses for the dangerous journey ahead. Sarah tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Uncle," she said in Apache, "Mama told me something else before the bad men killed her." "What was that, little one?" "She said the spirits told her that you would help us turn her death into something powerful, something that would protect all, the children who come after us." Daniel lifted his niece onto his horse, understanding for the first time that his sister's murder hadn't been random violence, but a deliberate sacrifice intended to preserve evidence that could prevent future massacres. The war for justice was just beginning, but for the first time in 16 years, Daniel Whitehorse was fighting for family rather than duty. And that made all the difference. The mountain trail to Denver stretched before them like a serpent carved into stone, winding through passes that could hide a dozen ambushes or provide salvation to travelers who knew how to read the landscape's subtle warnings. Daniel guided his paint horse along the narrow ledge, constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit while monitoring the 5 riders who followed single file behind him. 3 days had passed since their escape from Mesa Verde, and the weight of responsibility pressed on Daniel's shoulders like a physical burden. Each child represented not just a life to protect, but a fragment of testimony that could topple territorial governments and reshape the political landscape of the Southwest. Rebecca rode directly behind him, her military bearing evident even in the saddle as she maintained tactical spacing while keeping the children within protective range. Her transformation from frontier teacher to intelligence operative had been complete, revealing layers of training and experience that explained her remarkable competence under fire. "Uncle Daniel," Sarah's voice carried forward from her position. On Thomas's horse, "How much farther to the safe place?" The question stabbed at Daniel's heart because he wasn't certain any truly safe place existed for children whose testimony threatened powerful men. Denver offered federal protection and legal recourse, but the journey itself exposed them to dangers that multiplied with each mile traveled. "2 more days if the weather holds," Daniel replied, noting the dark clouds gathering above the peaks ahead. "Maybe 3 if we hit snow." The approaching storm represented both threat and opportunity. Bad weather would slow their progress and increase the risk of exposure, but it would also hamper any pursuit teams that Morrison might have dispatched to track them down. Behind Sarah, the twins Miguel and Diego maintained the stoic silence that had characterized their behavior since the schoolhouse battle. At 8 years old, they'd already witnessed more violence than most adults experienced in a lifetime, and their withdrawn demeanor suggested psychological wounds that would require years to heal. Maria, the 10-year-old daughter of a murdered tribal leader, rode with the competent ease of someone raised around horses. But Daniel noticed how her dark eyes constantly scanned their back trail, displaying the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary and danger could emerge without warning. Thomas, at 12, the oldest of the children, had appointed himself as their unofficial guardian and scout. His position in the riding order allowed him to communicate with both the adults and younger children, serving as a vital link in their small community's chain of survival. "Miss Carson," Thomas called softly. "There's smoke rising from the valley. Behind us could be campfires." Rebecca immediately signaled for a halt, dismounting to examine the distant wisps through a small telescope she'd produced from her saddlebags. Her professional assessment of the situation would determine whether they needed to alter their route or prepare for confrontation. 3 separate fires, she reported after a long moment of observation. Spaced for perimeter security rather than comfort. Someone's camping down there with military discipline. The news confirmed Daniel's worst fears. Morrison hadn't accepted their escape as final defeat. He'd organized a pursuit team and was systematically tracking them through the mountain wilderness. The militia leader's reputation had been built on successful completion of difficult missions, and failure to eliminate the Clearwater witnesses would damage his standing with the powerful employers who funded his operations. "How much time do we have before they reach us?" Daniel asked, while studying the terrain ahead for defensive positions or alternative routes. Rebecca collapsed her telescope with military precision. 6 hours, maybe 8 if they're being cautious about altitude and weather. But that assumes they're following our actual trail instead of taking shortcuts through terrain we can't traverse with the children. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Their small group couldn't match the speed of professional trackers unencumbered. By children's safety, and the approaching storm would make travel increasingly dangerous for horses carrying double loads. "There's an old mining camp about 4 miles ahead," Daniel said, drawing on his extensive knowledge of territorial geography. "Abandoned silver mine with buildings that might provide shelter and defensive positions." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "Better to choose our ground than let them choose it for us." As they resumed their climb toward the mining camp, Daniel found himself remembering stories his mother had told about ancestors who'd fought similar battles against overwhelming odds. Apache warfare traditions emphasized mobility, terrain knowledge, and the psychological impact of well-executed ambushes, lessons that might prove valuable in their current situation. But this wasn't traditional Apache warfare against conventional enemies. This was a desperate attempt to protect children while navigating political conspiracies that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The skills that had served Daniel well as a scout would need to be supplemented by Rebecca's intelligence training and pure determination to see justice served. The abandoned mining camp materialized through the gathering dusk like a ghost town frozen in time. Weather-beaten buildings clustered around the entrance to what had once been a productive silver mine, their wooden walls gray with age, but still structurally sound enough to provide shelter from the approaching storm. More importantly, the camp's position on a natural shelf provided excellent visibility of the approach routes, while offering multiple escape paths through the surrounding canyon system. If Morrison's men located them here, at least they'd have warning and options for evasion. "Thomas, help me with the horses." Daniel instructed, while Rebecca began examining the buildings for defensive potential. Miguel and Diego gather firewood. From inside the structures only. We can't risk smoke giving away our position. The children moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of previous emergency camps during their months with Rebecca. They'd learned to work as a team, each contributing according to their abilities while maintaining the discipline necessary for survival in hostile territory. Sarah remained close to Daniel, her small hand occasionally touching his arm as if to reassure herself that her recently discovered uncle wasn't another figure who might vanish from her life. The connection between them had grown stronger during their 3 days of travel, fed by shared memories of Morning Star and the Apache traditions that linked them across years of separation. "Uncle," Sarah said quietly, while they settled the horses in a sheltered area behind the main building, "Miss Carson has bad dreams. She talks in her sleep about the day Mama died." The observation provided insight into Rebecca's psychological state that her professional demeanor had concealed. Witnessing the Clearwater Massacre and failing to prevent it had left emotional scars that military training couldn't completely suppress. "What does she say in her dreams?" Daniel asked gently. "She keeps saying, 'I was too late, I was too late.' And sometimes she cries." Daniel's respect for Rebecca deepened as he understood the personal guilt she carried alongside her professional responsibilities. She'd been sent to investigate irregularities in territorial militia contracts, but had arrived at Clearwater just in time to witness the massacre she might have prevented with earlier intelligence. Inside the main building, Rebecca had established a command post using maps and documents from her seemingly inexhaustible supply of intelligence materials. Her preparation for this mission had been exhaustive, covering not just escape routes and supply caches, but detailed analysis of the political networks they were challenging. "I've been thinking about our Denver strategy," she said, as Daniel joined her at the improvised planning table. "Simply presenting the children's testimony won't be enough. We need to provide federal prosecutors with actionable intelligence that connects the Clearwater Massacre to specific individuals in positions of authority." Daniel studied the maps and documents spread before them, noting connections drawn between territorial officials, militia commanders, and federal congressional representatives. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple regional politics. "You've identified the key players," Daniel observed, "but proving their involvement will require more than witness testimony from traumatized children." Rebecca's smile held no warmth, "which is why I've been documenting everything for 6 months. Financial records, communications intercepts, travel logs that place suspects at relevant locations during key time periods. The children's testimony will provide the emotional impact, but documentary evidence will secure convictions." The scope of her investigation impressed Daniel, while simultaneously revealing the magnitude of the forces arrayed against them. Rebecca hadn't just stumbled onto a local corruption scheme. She'd uncovered a systematic effort to manipulate Apache conflicts for political and financial gain. "How did you get access to this level of documentation?" Daniel asked. "Some of it came through official Army intelligence channels before I realized how deeply the corruption had penetrated," Rebecca replied. "The rest I acquired through methods that probably violate several federal statutes." Her admission confirmed that she'd been operating as a rogue agent, using questionable tactics to gather evidence against suspects who included her own superiors. The personal and professional risks she'd assumed were staggering, explaining why she'd been forced to work alone. Outside the building, wind began to howl through the canyon as the promised storm arrived with mountain fury. Snow started falling in thick flakes that would soon obscure visibility and make travel treacherous for both pursuers and pursued. "The weather might buy us time," Daniel said, watching the storm's intensity through a gap-toothed window. Rebecca nodded while organizing her documents into waterproof containers. "But it also traps us here. If Morrison's men reach us before the storm passes, we'll have to fight rather than flee." The tactical reality was sobering. Their defensive position was strong, but they lacked the ammunition and supplies necessary for an extended siege. Morrison commanded professional fighters whose military experience made them formidable opponents, even in adverse conditions. Thomas appeared in the doorway, snow crystals clinging to his dark hair. "Miss Carson, there are lights moving in the valley, multiple sources spread across our back trail." The report confirmed that Morrison's pursuit team had maintained their pace despite deteriorating weather conditions. The militia leader was committed to completing his mission, regardless of environmental obstacles, understanding that failure to eliminate the witnesses would trigger consequences extending far beyond his own career prospects. "How many lights?" Rebecca asked, checking her rifle while calculating ammunition requirements for different combat scenarios. "At least 6, maybe more," Thomas replied with the precision of someone who'd learned to count enemy forces accurately during previous encounters with hostile parties. Daniel felt the familiar pre-combat tension settle over him like a familiar coat. The peaceful interlude of their journey was ending, replaced by the stark necessity of violence in defense of innocent lives. "Sarah," he called softly to his niece, "remember the hiding place Miss Carson showed you?" The little girl nodded, solemnly understanding that adult conversations about lights and positions meant danger was approaching. Her composure under stress reminded Daniel powerfully of his sister's courage during their final conversation months before the massacre that had cost Morning Star her life. Outside, the storm continued to build in intensity, while enemy lights crept steadily closer through the mountain darkness. The abandoned mining camp that had promised shelter was about to become a battlefield, and Daniel Whitehorse prepared to discover whether family bonds and righteous cause could overcome superior numbers and professional training. The war for justice was entering its next phase, and the price of truth was about to be measured in blood and sacrifice under the unforgiving stars of the Colorado Territory. The storm transformed the abandoned mining camp into a fortress of swirling white, where visibility dropped to mere yards, and the howling wind masked the sounds of approaching danger. Daniel crouched behind a weathered wooden barrier, his Winchester rifle loaded and ready, while ice crystals formed on his eyelashes from the brutal cold. Through the blizzard's fury, muzzle flashes began to wink like deadly fireflies as Morrison's men opened fire from concealed positions around the camp's perimeter. Their tactics showed professional coordination, establishing crossfire zones while maintaining communication through a system of whistle signals that cut through the storm's roar. "They're using the weather as cover," Rebecca observed from her position near the main building's reinforced doorway. "Standard mountain warfare doctrine. They'll try to close distance under cover of the snow, then overwhelm us with superior numbers." Daniel's military experience confirmed her assessment. Morrison had adapted his tactics to exploit environmental conditions, understanding that the storm neutralized many of the advantages that terrain knowledge typically provided to defenders. Bullet splintered the wooden beam inches from Daniel's head, announcing that at least one enemy sniper had achieved an effective firing position despite the blizzard's interference. The shot's trajectory suggested the marksman was positioned in the abandoned assay office, approximately 50 yards northeast of their main defensive position. "Thomas," Daniel called to the 12-year-old who'd taken responsibility for watching. "Their eastern approach. Can you see the building with the tall chimney?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied with military precision that reminded Daniel painfully of his sister's natural leadership abilities. "Someone's moving around inside there." The confirmation meant Morrison's men were systematically occupying the camp's outlying structures, creating a tightening noose of firing positions that would eventually make their current defensive stance untenable. Behind them, in the building's most protected corner, Maria and the twins maintained absolute silence, while Sarah clutched a cornhusk doll that Rebecca had somehow managed to preserve during their escape from Mesa Verde. The children's discipline under extreme stress spoke volumes about both their natural resilience and the training Rebecca had provided during months of preparation for exactly this scenario. Another whistle signal echoed through the storm, followed immediately by coordinated gunfire from 3 different directions. Morrison was orchestrating a classic suppression pattern designed to pin down the defenders, while assault teams moved into flanking positions. "We can't stay here," Rebecca announced, confirming Daniel's tactical assessment. "They'll have us surrounded." Within the hour, Daniel studied the camp's layout through gaps in the storm, searching for alternatives that might provide better defensive options or escape routes. The original miners had carved their settlement into the mountainside with practical efficiency, creating multiple levels connected by paths that were now treacherous with ice and snow. "The mine entrance," Daniel said, indicating a dark opening in the cliff face above their current position. "If we can reach it, the tunnel system might provide either escape routes or a choke point we can defend indefinitely." Rebecca followed, his gaze through the swirling snow. "Assuming the mine shafts are still stable after years of abandonment. Cave-ins are common in old silver workings. The risk was significant, but remaining in their current position guaranteed eventual defeat, as Morrison's superior numbers and professional coordination overwhelmed their improvised defenses. "Sarah," Daniel called to his niece, "remember the stories Mama told you about our people hiding in sacred caves?" The little girl's dark eyes brightened with understanding. Apache tradition included numerous accounts of successful defensive actions fought from cave systems, where knowledge of underground passages had allowed small groups to evade or defeat much larger enemy forces. "The spirits protect those who fight for family," Sarah replied in Apache, her words carrying the weight of cultural wisdom passed down through generations of survival against overwhelming odds. Daniel's decision crystallized as he realized that leading the children into the mine system wasn't just tactical necessity, it was a continuation of the spiritual and cultural resistance that his people had practiced for centuries. "Move to the mine entrance," he ordered, beginning the dangerous withdrawal under fire. "Thomas, you and I will provide covering fire while Rebecca gets the younger children to safety." The retreat across open ground tested every skill Daniel had learned during his years as a territorial scout. Enemy bullets whined through the air around them as they moved in practiced bounds, using abandoned mining equipment and natural rock formations as temporary cover between advances. Rebecca demonstrated her military training by efficiently moving the 3 youngest children while maintaining tactical awareness of threats from multiple directions. Her ability to function as both protector and combatant under extreme conditions impressed Daniel, even as it reminded him of the professional competence that had allowed her to survive months of solitary intelligence work. The mine entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some prehistoric creature, its timber supports weathered grey, but apparently still sound after decades of mountain weather. Daniel paused at the threshold, using his scout's instincts to evaluate the underground environment they were about to enter. Cool air flowed from the depths, carrying the metallic scent of old mining operations mixed with the mustiness of long abandonment. More importantly, the air current indicated that the mine system connected to other openings, providing the ventilation necessary for extended occupation and potential escape routes. "Thomas, light that lantern," Daniel instructed while scanning the tunnel's initial layout. "But keep the flame low. We need light to navigate, but we can't advertise our position to anyone following us." The soft glow revealed a main passage that extended deep into the mountain, with side tunnels branching off at regular intervals. Support timbers showed signs of age, but appeared structurally sound, and the floor remained relatively clear of debris that might indicate recent collapse activity. Behind them, gunfire intensified as Morrison's men discovered their withdrawal and began pursuing across the open ground they'd just traversed. The militia leader's angry shouts carried through the storm, his professional frustration evident as his carefully planned assault devolved into an underground pursuit operation. "How far back do these tunnels go?" Rebecca asked while helping Maria navigate around a pool of standing water that reflected their lantern light like a dark mirror. Daniel studied the mine's construction, drawing on knowledge gained during previous scouting missions in similar terrain. Silver mines in this region typically followed ore veins for several hundred yards. If the original miners were successful, there should be multiple levels connected by vertical shafts. The complex tunnel system offered both advantages and dangers. Multiple levels provided escape options and defensive positions, but they also created opportunities for the defenders to become lost or separated in unfamiliar underground terrain. Sarah's small hand found Daniel's in the lantern-lit darkness. "Uncle, this place feels like the sacred caves in Mama's stories, the ones where our ancestors waited for enemies to leave." Her observation carried psychological weight beyond simple childhood fear. If Sarah could connect their current situation to positive cultural narratives, she might maintain the emotional stability necessary to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. "The spirits of our people are with us," Daniel replied in Apache, providing the spiritual context that would help his niece process their dangerous circumstances. "We carry their wisdom and their strength." Behind them, electric lantern light began to flicker at the mine entrance as Morrison's men prepared to follow them. Into the underground labyrinth, the pursuit was entering a new phase, where professional military training would be challenged by terrain that favored defenders with knowledge, patience, and cultural connection to underground warfare traditions. Thomas extinguished their lantern as enemy light became visible, plunging them into absolute darkness that leveled the playing field between pursuers and pursued. In the blackness, Daniel's Apache heritage provided advantages that formal military training couldn't match. The ability to navigate by sound, smell, and intuitive understanding of natural environments. "This way," he whispered, guiding them toward a side passage that his scout's instincts suggested would lead deeper into the mine system. "Stay close and follow my voice." The darkness was so complete that movement required faith in Daniel's guidance and trust in each other's presence. Rebecca's military discipline meshed perfectly with the children's learned obedience, creating a coordinated unit that could move silently through hostile territory. Morrison's voice echoed from the main tunnel, his words distorted by underground acoustics, but clearly conveying orders for systematic search procedures. The militia leader was adapting his tactics to underground conditions, demonstrating the professional flexibility that had made him successful in previous operations. "Split into teams," Morrison commanded. "Search every side passage. They can't have gone far with children to slow them down." The order revealed both Morrison's tactical competence and his fundamental misunderstanding of the people he was hunting. Daniel and Rebecca weren't just adults encumbered by children. They were protectors whose motivation transcended normal human limitations, and the children themselves possessed survival skills learned through months of living under constant threat. As enemy search teams began exploring the mine's tributary passages, Daniel led his group deeper into the mountain through tunnels that seemed to extend endlessly into primordial darkness. The pursuit had become a deadly game of hide-and-seek, played in an underground maze where a single wrong turn could mean death for hunters and hunted alike. "Uncle," Sarah whispered so softly that only Daniel could hear her words, "Mama's spirit is here. She's showing me which way to go." Whether Sarah's guidance came from spiritual connection or subconscious recognition of air currents and acoustic patterns, Daniel chose to trust her instincts. His sister had possessed an uncanny ability to navigate in darkness, and genetics might have passed that gift to her daughter. Following Sarah's whispered directions, they turned into a passage that sloped downward toward what felt like the mine's deepest levels. Behind them, Morrison's search teams grew more distant as the underground labyrinth swallowed their lights and voices, but Daniel knew that escape was only temporary. Morrison commanded enough men to seal all known exits while maintaining systematic exploration of the mine system. Eventually, the defenders would be forced to choose between surrender and a final confrontation in the depths of the mountain. The war for justice had descended into the earth itself, where ancient stone would witness the climactic battle between those who killed for profit and those who died for truth. Deep beneath the Colorado mountains, where silver veins had once promised fortune to desperate men, Daniel Whitehorse found himself trapped in a cathedral of stone that would either become his family's tomb or the birthplace of their redemption. The mine's lowest level opened into a natural cavern that the original miners had discovered during their excavations, a vast underground chamber where crystalline formations caught and reflected their meager light like stars frozen in time. Sacco. Cavern's acoustics amplified every sound, from the children's careful breathing to the distant echoes of Morrison's search teams methodically working their way through the upper tunnels. Water dripped steadily from limestone formations, creating a rhythm that seemed to mark the countdown to their final confrontation. "This is where we make our stand," Rebecca announced quietly, her intelligence training recognizing the tactical advantages the cavern provided. Single entrance, multiple positions for cover, and enough space to maneuver if necessary. Daniel studied the chamber's natural architecture, noting how centuries of water erosion had created stone pillars and formations that could serve as defensive positions. The cavern's size would force Morrison's men to spread out when they entered, negating their numerical advantage while exposing them to crossfire from concealed positions. More importantly, the chamber felt spiritually significant in ways that transcended military tactics. Ancient petroglyphs covered sections of the walls, symbols left by indigenous peoples who had used this place for ceremonies long before European miners arrived seeking silver. Sarah had noticed the markings immediately, her young face showing recognition that went beyond simple curiosity. "Uncle," she whispered in Apache, "this is a sacred place. The old ones came here to speak with spirits and receive visions." The revelation added layers of meaning to their desperate situation. They weren't just hiding in a convenient cave. They had found sanctuary in a place where generations of Daniel's people had sought spiritual guidance during times of crisis. Thomas had taken position behind a natural stone barrier where he could watch the chamber's entrance while remaining protected from rifle fire. At 12 years old, he possessed combat instincts that would have impressed professional soldiers. But Daniel could see the psychological toll that constant danger was taking on the boy's young spirit. "Thomas," Daniel called softly, "how are you holding up?" The boy's response carried maturity far beyond his years. "I'm scared, but not for myself. If something happens to us, who's going to tell the truth about what they did to our families?" His words crystallized the moral weight of their situation. These children weren't just victims seeking survival. They were the living repository of testimony that could expose crimes reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. Their deaths would silence evidence that might prevent future massacres of innocent people. Rebecca had used the cavern's natural features to create a command post where she could coordinate their defense while protecting her intelligence documents. From moisture and potential gunfire, Her professional demeanor remained intact, but Daniel noticed subtle signs of exhaustion that suggested she was approaching the limits of even her remarkable endurance. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Daniel asked, conducting the inventory that would determine their tactical options. 43 rounds for your Winchester," Rebecca replied after checking their supplies. 37 for my rifle, plus 18 rounds for the revolver. Thomas has 12 shots left for that old Colt he's been carrying. The numbers painted a sobering picture. They possessed enough firepower to conduct a brief but intense engagement, but not enough to sustain prolonged combat against Morrison's well-equipped force. Every shot would need to count if they hoped to survive long enough for rescue or escape. Above them, electric lantern light began to penetrate the upper passages as Morrison's search teams worked systematically toward the cavern level. The militia leader's voice carried through the stone corridors, directing his men with the confident authority of someone accustomed to completing difficult missions regardless of obstacles. "They're down there somewhere," Morrison's words echoed. "Through the mine shafts, spread out when we reach the bottom level, but maintain visual contact. These aren't professional soldiers. They're a broken-down scout and a rogue intelligence officer with a bunch of half-breed children." The contempt in Morrison's voice revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces he was confronting. He saw desperate fugitives where Daniel and Rebecca were actually experienced warriors, fighting for principles that transcended personal survival. Maria, who had remained silent through most of their underground journey, suddenly spoke up from her position near the ancient petroglyphs. "Miss Carson, the pictures on the wall, they tell a story about warriors who defeated enemies by calling on the spirits of this place." Her observation prompted Daniel to examine the stone markings more carefully. The petroglyphs did indeed seem to depict a battle scene where smaller forces had overcome larger ones through what appeared to be supernatural intervention. Whether the images represented actual historical events or mythological narratives, they provided psychological encouragement that might prove as valuable as additional ammunition. "The spirits of our ancestors are with us," Daniel told the children in Apache, understanding that cultural connection would help them maintain courage during the coming battle. "They faced enemies who wanted to destroy our people, just like the men who killed your families." Sarah moved closer to the petroglyph wall, her small fingers tracing symbols that seemed to glow in their lantern light. "Uncle, Mama taught me that when Apache warriors fight in sacred places, the spirits make their aim true and their enemies confused." Whether or not spiritual intervention would influence the coming battle, Daniel recognized that Sarah's faith provided psychological armor that rational analysis couldn't match. Her connection to Apache traditions gave her strength that Morrison's men couldn't understand or counter. The sound of boots on stone announced that Morrison's advance team had reached the passage leading to the cavern. Their electric lanterns created shifting patterns of light and shadow that warned of their approach, while revealing nothing about their specific numbers or tactical formation. "Remember," Rebecca whispered, checking her rifle's action one final time, "we're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting for justice, for truth, and for every innocent family that these men might target in the future." Her words transformed their desperate situation into something larger than mere survival. They were conducting the final battle in a war between those who profited from violence and those who sacrificed everything to protect the innocent. Morrison appeared at the cavern entrance first, his scarred face grim with determination as he surveyed the underground chamber that would serve as their battlefield. Behind him, Daniel counted 8 additional men, a formidable force for close-quarters combat, but fewer than the dozen who had originally attacked the schoolhouse. "Miss Carson!" Morrison called into the cavern, his voice echoing off stone walls carved by centuries of patient water. You've led us quite a chase, but it ends here. Surrender now, and I guarantee the children will die quickly." His offer revealed the absolute nature of his mission. Morrison hadn't been sent to capture prisoners. He'd been ordered to eliminate witnesses regardless of circumstances. The militia leaders' employers had decided that the political risks of exposure outweighed any moral considerations about murdering children. "Captain Morrison," Rebecca replied from her concealed position, "I have a counter-proposal. Surrender yourself and your men to federal custody, and I'll make sure you receive fair trials instead of summary execution for treason." Morrison's laughter echoed harshly through the sacred space. "Federal custody? Miss Carson, my employers include federal officials. There's nowhere in the territory you can run that we won't eventually find you." The revelation confirmed Rebecca's worst fears about the conspiracy's scope. Corruption had penetrated so deeply into territorial and federal agencies that traditional law enforcement channels offered no protection for witnesses seeking justice. But Daniel had stopped listening to Morrison's psychological warfare, focusing instead on tactical preparations for the battle that was now inevitable. His Apache heritage provided insights into fighting from concealed positions in natural terrain, while his military experience supplied knowledge of coordinated defensive tactics. "When I start shooting," Daniel whispered to Rebecca, "work your way toward the eastern wall. Those formations will give you clear fields of fire while protecting you from return shots." Rebecca nodded, understanding that their survival depended on precise coordination during the opening moments of combat. Morrison's men would initially have the advantage of numbers and superior equipment, but the cavern's layout could neutralize those advantages if the defenders executed their positions perfectly. Morrison signaled to his men, who began spreading out across the cavern entrance in preparation for a coordinated assault. Their electric lanterns created a wall of light that would blind the defenders while illuminating targets for concentrated fire. "Last chance, Carson," Morrison called out. "We can do this easy or hard, but we're taking those children either way." Sarah's voice cut through the tension, speaking in clear Apache. "The spirits of the sacred place will protect us. The enemy's lights will become darkness, and their weapons will turn against them." Whether through spiritual intervention or simple, mechanical failure, one of Morrison's electric lanterns suddenly went dark, plunging a section of his assault line into unexpected shadow. The equipment failure created confusion and opportunity that Daniel seized without hesitation. His first shot took down Morrison's point man, the 4440 slug, sending the militiaman tumbling backward into his companions. Rebecca's rifle spoke almost simultaneously, her round finding another target with the precision of professional training. The battle for the sacred cavern had begun, and in the depths of the Colorado mountains, justice and corruption would finally meet in combat that would determine the fate of 5 children whose testimony could reshape the American Southwest. The cavern erupted into chaos as muzzle flashes strobed through the ancient darkness, turning the sacred space into a deadly constellation of gunfire and ricocheting bullets. Daniel rolled behind a limestone formation as Morrison's men returned fire with professional discipline, their shots chipping stone fragments from the walls where petroglyphs had recorded centuries of tribal history. "Thomas, stay low!" Rebecca shouted over the gunfire, her military training evident as she used the cavern's natural acoustics to coordinate their defense without revealing her position to enemy marksmen. The 12-year-old boy pressed himself against the stone barrier, his young face set with determination that reminded Daniel painfully of his sister's courage during their final conversation. Thomas gripped his oversized revolver with steady hands, waiting for a clear shot that would justify expending one of his precious remaining rounds. Morrison's tactical adaptation to underground combat impressed Daniel despite their adversarial relationship. The militia leader had quickly recognized that the cavern's layout favored defenders, so he'd ordered his men to establish a base of fire at the entrance while sending flanking teams through side passages they'd discovered during their descent. "They're trying to get behind us," Daniel called to Rebecca, noting movement in the shadows beyond their primary defensive line. At least 2 men working through the eastern passages. Rebecca's response came in the form of precise rifle fire that forced the flanking team back into cover. Her marksmanship skills exceeded even Daniel's expectations, each shot placed with surgical accuracy that spoke of extensive combat experience rather than simple training exercises. The twins, Miguel and Diego, had wedged themselves into a natural alcove where ancient water erosion had carved a protective shelter in the cavern wall. At 8 years old, they understood enough about gunfights to remain absolutely motionless while chaos raged around them, their dark eyes reflecting lantern light like captured stars. "Miss Carson," Maria called from her position near the petroglyphs. "There's another passage back here. I can see air moving through it." The discovery of an additional exit route provided hope for escape if their defensive position became untenable. But it also created another avenue for Morrison's men to exploit, potentially trapping the defenders between converging assault teams. Daniel's next shot found its mark, dropping a militiaman who'd been attempting to advance using the cavern's natural formations as cover. The 44-40 slug sent the man spinning into a limestone pool that turned crimson with his blood, marking the sacred space with violence that seemed to violate its spiritual sanctity. "7 down, 6 to go," Rebecca observed with clinical detachment, her intelligence background allowing her to maintain tactical awareness despite the emotional weight of their situation. But Morrison's voice carried through the gunfire with undiminished confidence. "Carson, you're just delaying the inevitable. Even if you kill all my men, there are more teams in the area. You can't fight the entire territorial government." His words carried the ring of truth that chilled Daniel's blood. Morrison represented only one tentacle of a conspiracy that possessed virtually unlimited resources for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. Even victory in this underground battle might only postpone their ultimate defeat. Sarah's small voice cut through the tactical discussion, speaking in Apache with an intensity that demanded attention. "Uncle, the spirits are angry about the blood in their sacred place. They want the bad men to leave." As if responding to her words, one of Morrison's electric lanterns suddenly exploded in a shower of sparks and broken glass. The equipment failure plunged another section of the assault team into darkness, while creating confusion that Rebecca immediately exploited with deadly accurate rifle fire. "2 more down," she announced, after her shots found their targets in the unexpected shadow. Whether the lantern failure resulted from supernatural intervention or simple mechanical malfunction, its psychological impact on Morrison's remaining men was profound. Professional soldiers could cope with superior tactics and marksmanship, but equipment failures that defied rational explanation created doubt that undermined their tactical confidence. Thomas took advantage of the enemy's momentary confusion to fire his first shot of the battle, the old Colt bucking in his young hands as he targeted a militiaman who'd exposed himself while trying to retrieve his fallen comrade's rifle. The boy's aim proved true, his bullet catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him out of the fight. "Good shot," Daniel called to his young protege, understanding that Thomas needed encouragement to maintain his courage during the terrifying ordeal of close-quarters combat. But Morrison was adapting his tactics again, recognizing that direct assault was proving too costly against defenders who possessed both superior positions and unexpected marksmanship skills. His next orders revealed a shift towards siege tactics that would exploit the defenders' limited ammunition supply. "Fall back to the entrance," Morrison commanded his surviving men. "Establish overwatch positions and wait them out. They can't have much ammunition left." The tactical withdrawal created a more dangerous situation for the defenders. Morrison's men could maintain their blockade indefinitely while systematically exploring alternative passages that might provide flanking routes or escape prevention. The militia leader was gambling that patience would succeed where direct assault had failed. "He's right about the ammunition," Rebecca admitted quietly, checking her remaining rounds with professional concern. "We have maybe 20 shots left between all of us." The mathematics of attrition warfare were working against them. Morrison commanded enough men to maintain shifts around the clock, while his supply lines could provide food, water, and ammunition. For extended operations, the defenders faced dehydration, starvation, and eventual ammunition exhaustion unless they could break the siege or find alternative solutions. But Daniel's Apache heritage provided insights that Morrison's conventional military training couldn't anticipate. Underground warfare held special significance in tribal traditions, where knowledge of cave systems had often provided sanctuary during impossible odds against better-equipped enemies. "Maria," Daniel called to the 10-year-old near the petroglyphs, "show me that passage you found." The girl led him to a narrow opening in the cavern's eastern wall, where air currents indicated connection to external ventilation systems. The passage was too small for adults, but large enough for children to navigate if they possessed the courage to attempt escape through unknown underground terrain. "Where does it lead?" Daniel asked, though he suspected Maria couldn't answer. "With certainty, I don't know," she replied honestly, "but the air smells like outside, like snow and pine trees." The external air suggested that the passage eventually connected to the surface, providing a potential escape route that Morrison's men hadn't discovered. But using it would require separating the children from their adult protectors, exposing them to dangers that might prove worse than their current siege situation. Rebecca had been monitoring their conversation while maintaining watch on Morrison's positions. If the children can reach the surface, they might be able to get word to federal authorities in Denver. Colonel Hayes would respond immediately if he knew the scope of what we've uncovered. The plan offered hope, but it also required making an impossible choice. Sending the children through unknown passages might save their lives, but it would also expose them to cave-ins, getting lost, or captured by Morrison's perimeter teams. Keeping them in the cavern guaranteed they would share whatever fate awaited the adults. Thomas had been listening to their discussion with the intense focus that characterized his approach to adult conversations. "Miss Carson, if we stay here, we all die together. If some of us escape, maybe we can save the others later." His tactical analysis was sound, but it required emotional maturity that few 12-year-olds possessed. Thomas was volunteering to lead younger children through dangerous terrain while accepting that he might never see his adult protectors again. Sarah approached Daniel, her small hand finding his as she looked up with eyes that reflected wisdom far beyond her 6 years. "Uncle Mama's spirit says the sacred place will protect you and Miss Carson, but we children need to carry the truth to people who can help." Her words carried the weight of spiritual guidance that Daniel couldn't ignore. If Sarah believed that Apache spirits were directing their actions, he had to trust in traditions that had sustained his people through centuries of impossible struggles. Morrison's voice echoed through the cavern again. "Carson, my patience is running out. Surrender now, and I'll make the children's deaths quick. Continue this resistance, and I'll make sure they suffer before they die." The threat crystallized Daniel's decision. Morrison represented evil that would never show mercy regardless of circumstances. The children's only hope lay in escape, even through dangerous passages that might claim their lives through accident rather than malice. "Thomas," Daniel said quietly, You'll lead them through the passage. Maria knows the way to start, and Sarah will help you navigate by following air currents. Stay together, move carefully, and don't stop until you reach the surface." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility being placed on his young shoulders. He would be leading 4 younger children through underground terrain that could kill them in dozens of ways, guided only by intuition and the desperate hope that they would find help before Morrison's conspiracy silenced them forever. As the children prepared for their dangerous journey into the unknown passages, Daniel realized that their survival would depend not just on courage and skill, but on the protective spirits of a sacred place that had sheltered his people for generations beyond memory. The narrow passage swallowed the 5 children like a stone throat, their small forms disappearing into darkness that would either deliver them to safety or claim their lives in the mountain's hidden depths. Daniel watched until Thomas's lantern light faded completely, then turned back to face Morrison's siege with Rebecca, knowing they might never see those brave young souls again. "They're our future now," Rebecca said quietly, reloading her rifle. "With the last of her ammunition, everything we've fought for travels with them." The weight of that responsibility settled over Daniel, like a mantle passed down through generations of Apache warriors who'd sacrificed themselves so their people could survive. His sister Morning Star had died protecting the peace process. Now, he would follow her example by ensuring her daughter and the other witnesses could carry truth beyond Morrison's reach. Morrison's voice echoed through the cavern with renewed urgency. "Carson! I know those children are gone. Tell me where they went, and I'll make this quick for both of you." The militia leader had obviously noticed the children's absence, but his increasingly desperate tone suggested he didn't know about the escape passage. Morrison was facing the possibility that his mission had failed, that the witnesses who could destroy his employers had slipped beyond his grasp. "Captain Morrison," Rebecca called back with professional composure, "I have a final offer for you. Surrender now, and I'll recommend that federal prosecutors consider a plea agreement in exchange for your testimony against your employers." Morrison's laughter carried bitter recognition of his impossible situation. "You still don't understand, Carson. There won't be any federal prosecutors. My employers control the entire territorial justice system." His words revealed the conspiracy's true scope, but also its fundamental weakness. Organizations that relied on absolute control became vulnerable when that control was challenged by people willing to sacrifice everything for truth. Daniel used the continuing dialogue to study their tactical situation with the detached analysis his military training demanded. They possessed perhaps 8 rounds of ammunition between them, while Morrison commanded at least 4 surviving men with superior firepower and defensive positions. Mathematical victory was impossible, but Apache tradition taught that some battles were won through spirit rather than strategy. The ancient petroglyphs seemed to glow in their fading lantern light, depicting warrior spirits who'd faced similar odds in defense of their people's survival. Daniel felt connection to those ancestral fighters, understanding that his death in this sacred place would join him to centuries of resistance against forces that sought to destroy indigenous peoples. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "when I start shooting, use your last rounds to collapse that entrance passage. If we can't win, we can at least buy the children more time." She nodded with the calm acceptance of a professional soldier who'd always known her career might end in sacrifice. For a cause larger than personal survival, her intelligence work had uncovered corruption that threatened the entire territorial system, ensuring that evidence reached honest authorities justified any personal cost. But before Daniel could implement his final desperate plan, new sounds echoed through the mine shafts above them. Not Morrison's men, but different voices calling out in military cadence that suggested the arrival of legitimate federal forces. "This is Colonel Marcus Hayes, United States Army." The authoritative voice carried through stone passages with unmistakable command presence. "Captain Morrison, you and your men will lay down your weapons immediately." Hope flared in Daniel's chest as he recognized his former commanding officer's voice. Somehow, word of their situation had reached federal authorities, triggering intervention that might yet save their lives and ensure justice for the Clearwater Massacre. Morrison's response revealed panic replacing his previous confidence. "Colonel, Hayes has no jurisdiction here. This is a territorial militia operation under proper authorization." "Captain Morrison," Hayes replied with deadly calm, "you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of federal statutes governing military conduct. Surrender now or face the consequences of resisting lawful federal authority." The confrontation above represented everything Daniel and Rebecca had fought to achieve: legitimate authority challenging the corrupt conspiracy that had murdered peace negotiators and threatened innocent children. But Morrison's men were professional fighters who might choose violent resistance over surrendering to face certain prosecution. Gunfire erupted in the upper passages as Morrison's remaining men engaged Hayes's federal forces. The battle's intensity suggested that the militia fighters had indeed chosen resistance, preferring death in combat to execution for treason and murder. "How did Hayes know where to find us?" Rebecca wondered, checking her rifle's action while monitoring the sounds of combat above. Daniel smiled grimly as understanding dawned. "Thomas, that boy's smarter than any of us realized. He didn't just lead the children to safety, he led them to the closest federal authorities he could find." The tactical brilliance of Thomas's leadership impressed Daniel even as pride swelled in his chest. The 12-year-old had understood that rescuing the adults required more than just escaping the mine. It demanded bringing help that could overcome Morrison's superior forces and political connections. Morrison appeared at the cavern entrance, his scarred face reflecting desperation, as he realized his carefully planned operation was collapsing into complete disaster. Behind him, the sounds of gunfire indicated that Hayes's men were systematically eliminating his remaining followers. "Carson, Whitehorse," Morrison called into the cavern, "this isn't over. Even if you survive today, the conspiracy reaches further than you can imagine. Those children will never be safe." Daniel stepped into view with his Winchester raised, understanding that Morrison represented not just personal threat, but institutional evil that would continue threatening innocent people unless permanently stopped. "Morrison," Daniel replied with quiet authority, "the conspiracy dies with you. Those children are under federal protection now, and their testimony will expose everyone involved in the Clearwater Massacre." The militia leader's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Daniel's rifle spoke first. The 44-40 slug caught Morrison center mass, spinning him backward into the stone passage where his blood joined that of the peace negotiators he'd murdered 6 months earlier. As Morrison's body settled into final stillness, Daniel felt spiritual completion that transcended mere tactical victory. Justice for his sister's murder had been achieved in the sacred place where Apache warriors had sought spiritual guidance. For generations, Colonel Hayes appeared in the cavern entrance, his weathered face showing relief as he surveyed the scene. "Daniel, Miss Carson, are you injured?" "We're alive," Rebecca replied, "thanks to 5 remarkable children who proved." "And the courage isn't measured by age or size." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Those children reached my patrol 2 hours ago. Thomas gave me a tactical briefing that would have impressed West Point instructors. They're all safe, by the way, and asking for both of you." The news that all 5 children had survived their underground journey sent waves of relief through Daniel's exhausted body. Sarah, Thomas, Maria, Miguel, and Diego had not only escaped Morrison's trap, but had successfully contacted help that could ensure their protection and justice for their murdered families. "Colonel," Rebecca said formally. "I have extensive documentation of the conspiracy behind the Clearwater Massacre. The evidence includes financial records, communications intercepts, and witness testimony that will expose corruption reaching into territorial and federal agencies." Hayes accepted the intelligence materials with professional gravity. "Miss Carson, your investigation has triggered the largest federal corruption probe in territorial history. The Attorney General himself has assigned special prosecutors to handle this case." As they emerged from the mine system into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after hours underground, Daniel saw a sight that filled his heart with joy beyond description. 5 children sat around a military campfire, their young faces showing exhaustion, but also the peace that came from knowing they were finally safe. Sarah broke free from the group and ran toward Daniel, her small arms wrapping around his legs. As she spoke in rapid Apache, "Uncle, Mama's spirit is happy now. The bad men can't hurt anyone else's family." Thomas approached with the mature bearing that had characterized his leadership throughout their ordeal. "Mr. Whitehorse, Miss Carson, we told the soldiers everything about the massacre, about the men who did it, about why they wanted to kill us." Colonel Hayes smiled proudly. "These children have provided testimony that will reshape territorial governance and federal oversight of military operations. Their courage has ensured that the Clearwater Massacre will be remembered as a turning point toward justice rather than a successful cover-up." 3 months later, Daniel stood in a Denver courtroom watching federal prosecutors present evidence that would convict dozens of officials for conspiracy, murder, and treason. The children's testimony, supported by Rebecca's documentation, had indeed triggered investigations reaching into the highest levels of government. Sarah sat beside him, healthy and happy in her new life at a federal boarding school, where her Apache heritage was celebrated rather than suppressed. Thomas had been accepted into a military academy where his tactical brilliance could be properly developed. Maria, Miguel, and Diego were thriving in families that understood their need for both cultural connection and educational opportunity. Rebecca had returned to Army intelligence with a promotion and assignment to investigate similar corruption in other territories. Her work in exposing the Clearwater conspiracy had established her as the federal government's premier expert on territorial militia abuse and civilian protection. "Uncle," Sarah whispered during a court recess, "Mama visits me in dreams sometimes. She says our people's spirits are strong because we chose truth over safety." Daniel nodded, understanding that his sister's sacrifice had indeed transformed into something larger than personal tragedy. The Clearwater Massacre had become a catalyst for federal reforms that would protect indigenous peoples and honest settlers from the corrupt militias that had terrorized the territories. Justice had been achieved not through violence alone, but through the courage of children who refused to let truth die with their murdered families. In the sacred cavern beneath the Colorado mountains, ancient spirits had indeed guided modern warriors toward victory that honored both the living and the dead. The half-blood scout, who had once wandered between worlds, had finally found his purpose, protecting the innocent and ensuring that family bonds proved stronger than the hatred that sought to destroy them. In saving 5 orphan children, Daniel Whitehorse had discovered that the greatest battles were fought not for territory or gold, but for the simple right of children to grow up in a world where truth mattered more than profit. The war for justice was won, but its victory would echo through generations of children who would never know how close they came to growing up in a territory ruled by fear rather than law. In the end, Morningstar's daughter and the other young witnesses had proven that sometimes the smallest voices carry the power to topple the mightiest corruptions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this One hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.